if we have multiple different classes, we can have different interactions between those classes. For example, we've got here an animal class and a dog class. Now, a dog is a type of animal. It's a more specific type of animal. So we have a connection between these two that we are using inheritance to represent. A dog is a or is an animal, and so we can use inheritance. Composition is a different type of relation between different classes. So, for example, if we had a car class, a car has an engine. An engine isn't a car, and a car isn't an engine, but a car has an engine. So we have this different type of connection here, and that's called composition. Let's build out a different example of composition. So a different example of composition would be a player in a game might be able to have or have a weapon. So for example, a sword or an axe. Okay, so let's start off with the player class. So class player. And maybe the player has a name, string name. And let's make the constructor. So we're going to need public player. We're going to need string new name. And we can just do name equals new name. Okay, so but we also want to be able to hold a weapon. And the way that we represent composition in object-oriented languages is we have a property that is of type class. So when we have name here, we've got the type string. But what we can do is we can specify a class as the type of a variable that is a property. So we can have, maybe we're going to have an interface instead of an abstract or general class. Let's have iWeapon. And let's just call it weapon. Okay, we can't resolve iWeapon to a type because we don't have it yet, so let's just create that. Interface iWeapon. And maybe we're just going to have one method, public abstract method, but we don't need to specify abstract because it's an interface, we know it's going to be abstract. So public void, and let's call it attack. So any class that implements iWeapon must implement the attack method. Okay, so in order to give the player a weapon, what we're going to need to do is let's do player, my player, equals new player, and let's go with player 1 as the name, and that's going to be fine for now. And let's print out the name, why not? Okay, so now that we've printed out the name of the player, we need to be able to give the player a weapon. So what we want to be able to do is pass in to the parameters a new object, like we're doing with new player, but we're going to do another one of those inside of the brackets. So maybe we're going to have sword, and we'll see if we need any parameters for sword. So let's implement the sword class. We're going to implement the iWeapons interface. And we're getting an error because we haven't implemented attack yet. So let's do override and public void attack. And let's just say attacks with a sword. Let's just leave it at that for now. Let's also make a constructor. So just public sword, and I don't think we need to do anything special in there. Sword, we don't have any properties yet. Maybe we would want some properties down the line, maybe like a damage stat, but let's just leave it as blank for now. And okay, so the player constructor for sword is undefined. That's because we haven't added a second parameter to the constructor. So let's do that now. What we could do is specify that it's a sword, and that would work perfectly fine. But if we have a different type of weapon, say for example an axe, we want to be able to have any different kind of weapon be passed in. So what we can do is say iWeapon. We can't instantiate iWeapon, but iWeapon can be used as a data type to store a more specific object that implements iWeapon. So let's do iWeapon and new weapon, and weapon equals new weapon. Now what we should be able to do is go underneath the print statement, and we should be able to do myPlayer dot weapon. Now we have access to the sword that we've created, and we should be able to do dot attack. And if we run the whole program, we get the name, player 1, and attacks with a sword. Let's just do one more example using an axe instead of a sword. So in fact, let's just copy the whole thing because I'm lazy. So we're going to change this to axe, which means we need to change the constructor to axe. And technically we don't need to change this string, but it would make more sense if we do. And this would allow us to see the difference. So let's change this to an axe. We've now not had to change the type that we accept in because we've used an interface. And if we just run the program, we get player 1 and attacks with axe. We are able to mix inheritance and composition. So for example, maybe this name property is something that we want to abstract out to a person. So class person, and the person is going to have string name, and that means we can remove this. And if we just do extends for inheritance instead of implementing an interface, extends person, the player is now a person, and that should work the exact same. We haven't implemented a constructor for person, and so we don't need to use the super method, but we can if we want. If we wanted to do public person, and maybe this is going to take in a string new name, this would make a lot of sense because this is where we've defined the name property. We shouldn't really be doing this manually in every subclass of person. And so we can now do name equals new name. And now what we need to do is call the super function or super method, and the constructor for person with no parameters is not defined. That's because we need to enter the new name. And now we don't need the line to manually set the new name inside of the player class. So inheritance is used for is-a relationships. A player is a person, not necessarily, but in this case it is because we are inheriting person on the player class. So a player is a person, whereas composition is has a, so a player has a weapon, and that's how we can distinguish the two types of interaction between classes and objects. And that's all for composition. In the next video we're going to be talking about some object-oriented design.